from one population to another, adapted to different environments. So, and it's also, we have to remember that your personal life history is more important than a racial category, right? So did you get enough nutrition at this time? How much sunlight did you grow up in? What factors were weighing in as you were developing? So that's really what we want to turn our attention to right now. So your life history is from the point where you're an egg until the moment that you die, you are living in an environment, and nature is putting pressure on you to survive. And the different factors affect you at different times and at different rates. This is the reason why your grandparents don't take Flintstones chewable vitamins, right? They have a different set of requirements in older age than they do when you're a growing child. Different nutritional requirements because there are different stages of life. There's different paces of development. You grow a lot when you're young, and then you stop growing. And if you keep growing, you're not going to grow up, you're going to grow out. And so you can become obese if you have too much nutrition. And we'll come to that in a moment. So the stages of human development in your life are fertilization. So that's the moment when you become a new organism, 46 chromosomes, one cell. And your prenatal stage, we divide into 3 trimesters. And after 40 weeks of 40 weeks after conception, the female gives birth. And then birth takes place, and we have what's called postnatal stage, which is neonatal, the first month, infancy, which is the second month up until the end of lactation, and so when the child is weaned off of milk. Then you have childhood, and that's about 2 to 3 years old. And then you have childhood, which is 3 to 7-ish, around there. And juveniles, 7 to 10 years old for girls, and 7 to 12 years for boys. They develop a little bit slower. Then puberty starts to take place, and this can last days, it can last weeks. Puberty can be a long drawn-out process, or something that's very short. Your adolescence is the 5 to 10 years after puberty sets in. And then your adult stage is when you start to reach a sort of an equilibrium where you stop growing and you're trying to maintain all those healthy systems that your childhood developed. And that becomes harder and harder to do the more you age. And as you age, your body starts to break down and have a harder time maintaining those systems in adulthood. That reproductive period of adulthood, and then for especially females, there's menopause, and the process of growing older and your body start to have trouble maintaining its systems is what we call senescence. And it's not just a steady, inexorable rise from in terms of pace, right? We're not just adding and adding and adding. There's ups and downs. And we know these from, I probably remember having growth spurts. Probably remember not being able to eat enough food. You just could eat a truckload of food when you were 13 years old or something like that, and just because you were growing a lot. And there's some charts in your books that go through the different stages of development. And it's very important to remember that it's not just height, right? So you start to grow a lot immediately. And if you think about it, that makes a lot of sense. You started as one cell, and then that duplicated, and you doubled in size. You doubled in size in just a matter of moments. And then those 2 cells became 4 cells, and those 4 cells became 16 cells. And you kept duplicating and duplicating and duplicating when you were a fetus. And when you're born, you continue that very quick pace of growth. And that starts off very high. You're growing very quickly, very rapidly from a very young age, and then that starts to sort of taper off a little bit. There's a mid-growth spurt around age 8 or so, and then adolescence, puberty and adolescence starts to kick in, and around 12 or 13 years old, you start shooting up like a rocket. And that's just height. That's just building your bones and your muscles and that sort of a thing. But you're not just bones and muscles. You're not just a machine, a mechanical thing. You have things like a brain. You've got teeth that grow at different rates. Your body grows, and also you are going to have a reproductive system as well, so you can pass on those genes. So when do these things kick in? And it's interesting, you can break this down into not just, size is you're growing, but you also have things like brain development. And you can see that that's early on, very, very early on, from your earliest age. You're trying to learn the world around you. Now that says something, that our brains are really important to our survival. I mean, if you think about the development of something like a wildebeest or a zebra on the plains of the Serengeti, you probably have seen a nature documentary of a newborn herbivore in some savanna, and they give birth, and basically the mother gives the calf a little nudge and says, you better get running because there's lions out there. So, and if that baby wildebeest does not start hoofing it, it's a meal. It's a meal for lions. So its most important asset are its legs and its muscles and its speed and its power and its bulk. Not so for humans. The first thing that we start investing in is our brains. And so we start to build that up, and that tells you something about socialization, that humans use each other and learn their environment and their social environment as well as their natural environment, and that is how we're successful. So that's a really key, important thing that we're going to look at the evidence for how that developed, how that came to be in humans, in our ancestors, in later chapters. Also dentition. Now when you're drinking milk, you don't need teeth. But eventually you're going to be a drain on your mother, or your mother might have other children that she needs to feed. So you've got to start eating on your own. So your teeth start to come in, and you can see that dentition comes in at a certain time. That's extra calcium. But those are sort of temporary teeth. Your baby teeth come in, and then those fall out, and you have new dentition that are your permanent teeth that come in at that time. Now, we're going to see in later chapters that you can actually tell if you have nutritional stress at these times when your permanent teeth come in. So we can look at a skeleton, and you have permanent markers in your teeth that indicate when you were about 8 to 10 years old, something like that. When your adult teeth were coming in, did you have enough nutrition? Did you have stress? Did you have some sort of an environmental factor that was causing physical stress on you? Were you malnutrition? You can see that in the teeth because your teeth are permanent then. And that will tell you something about your childhood. And then, of course, we saw the body growth as well. But then your body your genes tell your body, don't worry about reproducing just yet. We're going to make sure that you're a successful organism before we let you start to reproduce. And so puberty is something that has a delayed entrance, that reproductive abilities don't come in until age 10 to 12 or something like that, or maybe even later. And so that is giving the body a bit of time to invest in itself first before you pass on those genes to the next generation. Because there's so much growth taking place in early development, this is one of the reasons why we pay such close attention in our modern world to prenatal and childhood health, right? So things like, if I were to smoke a cigarette, it probably wouldn't cause serious harm because my body is not developing new organs. I'm just maintaining I'm trying to maintain a steady, healthy body, but I'm not generating brain matter in huge quantities. I'm not creating a liver where there was not a liver. I'm not making bone structures where there was once cartilage. With the child, you are. And so all of this environmental stuff that's coming into you has an outsized effect because that becomes then part of your building blocks. So if you're building your body and you put all sorts of things like drugs or alcohol or smoking, it can not just affect you at that moment, but it can permanently affect the growth of organs and your body and your genetic trajectory. And this is where you have the difference between your genotype, which is your blueprints, and the phenotype, which is the actual thing that is built. So the correct nutrition and keeping all sorts of harmful things out of the way is important to creating something that is similar to what the genotype is. But let's face it, it's a really chaotic world out there. I don't think there's ever been a single human being who has been an exact expression of their genes. There's always some sort of an environmental factor. I have really, really big feet, for instance, and I always have since I was a little kid. And every doctor told me that I was going to be well over 6 feet tall. I'm not. I'm just under 6 feet, 5'11". What happened? Okay, maybe the doctors were wrong, but let's just assume that the doctors were right, that feet equals height, and I was just growing into them. Why didn't I make it there? Why didn't I make it to what my genes were telling me my height was going to be, 6 feet tall or taller? Why didn't I make it? Well, I don't know the answer to that question, but it could have been a number of things. Maybe I didn't have the right nutrition at the right time. Maybe my mother had a couple of glasses of wine when she was pregnant with me. I don't know. But some factor might very well have contributed to my phenotype, which is my actual height, being different from my genotype, which is what my likely instructions for creating my body would have been. And so who knows where that took place. So the other effect of these stages of development, obviously infancy is the period of the most rapid growth, and weaning varies, but that's usually when you have your deciduous teeth in by this time. And you develop your motor skills, and then you then can go and fend for yourself a little bit. You can run off and explore, and you can maybe even go and get your own food, which is great because if a mother wants to reproduce again and have another child, and for evolution that makes sense, that's something that is you're going to see more of that because that produces more offspring, and more offspring produced through that sort of behavior is then you'll see that behavior in those genes in the future. But the other side of that is that communities have to care for the young offspring. Humans are not like a wildebeest that's born. We don't just sort of shake off the birthing process and say, all right, I'm going to run with the herd. That doesn't happen. It takes years for a child. And let's face it, and I don't mean to be cruel, but human infants are just useless. They are absolute useless blobs of uselessness. They don't do anything. They just sit there and stare, and they can't even see that far. They rely on you. They're absolutely helpless. But they're learning, and that's what's happening, is that we've made a sort of an evolutionary compromise that we have to care for these offspring, but that caring for them also then allows them to develop their brain. If they're just developed in uterus, they're not actually learning social cues. They're not looking at faces. They're not learning colors and sounds and dangers and the way that you need to behave to survive. So our behavior and our socialization is very important. But this puts a lot of pressure on especially the mother, because the mother has to feed for years a child, and then that interrupts having the next child. So this we'll come back to this in a moment when we talk about menopause as well. So I'll bring this subject back up. An important part of what we're going to be looking at in later chapters is the fossil record. I haven't explained what fossils are yet, but they're not actually bones. They're casts of bones. And so for very old fossils, we don't have any DNA or any isotopes of what people were eating or anything like that. All we have is what the bones looked like. That's it. And we're lucky when we get those too. They're rare. So we need to understand where we're getting our evidence and our information from. And so while talking about human development in terms of soft tissue, brain development, deciduous teeth that fall out, your nutritional requirements at different stages, these are all things that do not exist in the archaeological record. They don't survive from the past. The only thing that survives are the impressions, the cast, the mineralized, fossilized bones of our ancestors. That's it. So you don't get muscle tissue, you don't get eyeballs, you don't get brains, you don't get any of that stuff. You don't get skin or hair. You only get what the bones look like. And you don't even have DNA or isotopes or anything like that either. So understanding bone development is a really important part of human understanding human evolution, because that's what our primary evidence is. And understanding the relationships between bones and the soft tissue is really important. So things like your bones are here underneath your skin and your muscles, but the muscles attach to that, and that is what allows you to move them around, right? So your bones are rigid and your muscles are creating tension and pulling in this way or that way. That allows you to get up and move and go find food to then build more muscle and bone. So understanding the development of bone growth is going to be really important for us later on. When you're born, bones require a lot of mineral investment, right? You've got to have a lot of calcium brought in. In fact, I have a friend who has two children, and she lost 2 teeth when she was pregnant with each of her children, because when she was pregnant, her children were sucking all of the calcium that she was eating out of her own body, and they were taking it for themselves, almost like a parasite. And that meant that she actually lost a tooth each time she got pregnant, because her body had made the decision to give all that calcium to her children. So they're taking all this these materials, building these bone structures, but it's a long process. It's so much calcium, and it requires so much investment throughout your whole life that when you're born, you actually are more cartilage than you are bone. And cartilage is like the things in between your bone. It's sort of a spongy material that causes, or that gives you a little bit of a cushion between them. And your bones fill in the hard bits right up into adulthood. And so physical anthropologists can take a look at a bone, and the diaphysis is the main bone shaft. But on young people, the epiphyses, the ends of those bones, especially the long bones, are going to have, they're going to be cartilaginous. And in fossils, cartilage doesn't fossilize. It's soft tissue. So it's only the long bone that fossilizes, mineralizes. And so you can actually, a physical anthropologist can tell with pretty good accuracy how old a skeleton is when it died, or the individual was when that individual skeleton became skeletonized. A bone that has really no ends to it, and it would have mean it was just been cartilage, is probably a young child. But for me, I'm old enough that all of my bone growth has finished, and so you can tell that I am an adult based on the fact that all of my epiphyses are complete. So this is something that we can use to look at the past. Also, your bone growth is a pretty good indicator of overall nutritional completeness. That are you getting enough nutrition? Because that's really your body is investing in building you up into the right size. That's a big factor. And you can assume that if you've got muscles on, or so if you've got bones on there, you've got muscles as well, and you've got all of the other tissue and circulatory system and heart and lungs and all those things that don't survive can be assumed to have been there as well. So if you're growing to a certain height, that's a pretty good indicator of overall health and nutrition. And so environment can influence long bone growth, and poor nutrition can stunt growth by limiting the production of cartilage in the growth plate. And this is something that we call the secular trend when we compare more recent populations of people. Humans in Europe in particular were sort of, as farmers, people that lived off of the land, didn't have great nutrition, but they didn't have poor nutrition. And in the 19th century, when people started to move into